All right. Welcome. We are now live. It's a little early in the morning for me. Well, it's not very early in the morning. I've been up for hours, but this is very early for a live stream for me. But I'm here with a very old friend. So I guess, should I mention the fact that I used to know you by a different blog name called was Merchant Struggle, correct?
Yeah, I've had tons. I've had tons and tons of different names, and I just recently, over the last couple of months, decided to switch back to the channel that was the largest. So that's why I'm being
Ah,
called Renaissance Man.
excellent. Now, that change was very early on when we were talking regularly around 2018, I think. And
Yeah, about that.
yeah, it was. That's just when I mean, it was a year after I started the YouTube channel, but those were crazy times. But today, just to set up your critique, I believe you reached out because we were discussing criticisms from of the right wing or the dissident right. There were a variety of people that kind of came on the scene that were particularly secularists that were critiquing the dissident right. And I think you wanted to talk about alternative criticisms from sort of the opposite direction.
Yeah, I think it's probably best to start with what's going well in the dissident right, or at least the dispositions that people have in the
Mm-hmm.
dissident right, which I think are very good and actually very rare in our countries. Because
Mm-hmm.
I think that one thing we have to be conscious of is that we are in a profound minority in the West in terms of our views. At least I am, in terms of my particular religious views and what I would do if I were in power, quite frankly. So I think that the tendency towards a more conservative, like seriously family oriented kind of existence is wonderful. And I think actually caring about our national cultures as opposed to this kind of all consuming corporate culture, this sort of this crying out for the higher culture is something that you don't see all that often, especially amongst the young. And I think it's a wonderful thing, as
Yeah.
well as the great love for our nations that we have. And I mean, I think that exploring these avenues will lead people in a, like, if it's explored properly, it's going to lead people to some really really good places. And I think that a lot of people here have the right ethic to perhaps reach there if they've got some pointing in the right direction. I think there are, as we've said here, issues that I've observed, and I mention this because I think that at least for the Christians here, and I'd say even more so for the secular and the pagans, because I rejoined the sphere through Substack perhaps a couple of months ago. I mean, I started getting properly involved a couple of months ago, and I started noticing certain things that I couldn't necessarily put my I can't put my finger on it, but there's a certain disturbance perhaps
Mm-hmm.
in the way that they communicate that tells me there's some things up. And I think that's probably the best place to start, because if we ultimately, and I know you guys all want to reclaim your homelands, we all want to reclaim our homelands, we all want to bring back order, and we want to pursue the good. But in order to
I
do
might
that,
be an exception. I don't have a homeland. I'm a complete nomad. I switched countries 2 times since we last talked. Now I'm in
well,
Canada.
in any case, we love those that are close to us, and we want to see them succeed, be they our family or our nations or our friends. And I think where this really ultimately starts is with this kind of attitude that I've seen in a lot of people posting. And I say this is less present in the Christians, but I think it's still kind of there. And you see it especially in the pagans and the secular people. And that is, quite frankly, that people are looking so much at the despair out in the world, and understandably so, right? Particularly in the US. And you can make up your own mind about my country, but a lot of people, I think, are allowing this to effectively depress and push down their lives. And aside from the fact that this is, a personal tragedy, we're allowing this to be a personal tragedy, perhaps when there's we're allowing this to be a personal tragedy on one hand. It's also making anybody in the dissident right, aside from all of the problems that already exist, less effective political actors. Because if somebody is depressed and they are facing down a world that ultimately, in some ways, deviates from our position either out of ignorance or malice. I think it depends on the person. It moves us away from what productive things that we could do. And I think that having that kind of understanding that, at least for the Christian and for the Muslim and for the Hindu is on our side. God is ultimately in control of this entire situation and sustains everything that is going on in the situation. And so we need to trust in that it will be all right. But of course, that's not going to be enough to cut it, as many people say. Well, it's like, oh, well, this is wishful thinking. But I think a lot of it comes from, quite frankly, a lack of spiritual formation. So a lack of focus on virtue. There's a lot of people who are interested in virtue here. You see this. I think that someone like Bap kind of taps into this quite instinctually, because he realizes, for all of his faults, that there are three things that young men want. They want to fight in a war, they want to go on an adventure, and they want to see something beautiful. And he presents these things to them, and he does it in a very effective rhetorical style, kind of like Nietzsche before him. The trouble is that it's a lie, or at least it's not the full truth, because he's right. We may well fight in this war for whatever. I think that the fixation on early archaic Greek culture that comes from Bap results in a kind of an incomplete picture of virtue, which has led to things like all kinds of chaos after the death of Alexander the Great. If anybody wants to read a piece of history that is very, very chaotic and I think embodies the worst parts of this kind of vitalist idea, they should go and read about Perdiccas and the people that succeeded Alexander the Great. But it ultimately leads to exactly what he says. You will be a beautiful corpse, but that is all you will be. But God offers us so much more. God, who has deigned even to let St. Thomas touch his very wounds, that is, to show us physical proofs and logical proofs, not only grants us the ability to be a beautiful corpse, but also to live in, not only in eternity, but in a better world than what Bap can possibly offer and what much of the dissident right can offer. And so I think that the Catholics here and the Protestants here and the Orthodox here, I aim to provide concrete steps for those people here and for any secular people or any pagans who are of any interest. If they want to have discussions or arguments or objections, then by all means, I'll go into the comment section and I'll talk to you. I'm not going to do this right now because I'm focusing on, of course, talking to you, Dave. But I can provide concrete steps for personal life, not only to grow this relationship with God and capture the ability to be more than just a beautiful corpse, but also to grow in life beyond that. I've got like a concrete set of steps right here that I can give. This is of course the first thing. The other thing we're going to get onto later will be, or I'd like to get onto later, would be discussions of, well, we have this problem ahead of us. How do we actually concretely figure out how we're going to establish governmental systems to prevent this corruption from crawling in again? Because there are a lot of young men here who are very motivated, very intelligent, very hardworking, and all they need to do is they need to be reading standard texts which built our civilization. Like, don't forget the tradition, the Catholic tradition terraformed Europe. It turned it from it depended on the part of Europe. Britain effectively collapsed after the Romans left. France did not suffer did not go particularly well in France either. Parts of North Africa were dominated by Arian heretics who were persecuting our fathers in faith.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. That's
I was saying this is, it's well taken with the Bap thing. I think Bap capitalizes on the fact that he can very eloquently describe the personal problem. And you see this with Nick Land too, which just like Nick Land has this incredibly insightful way of describing the problem of modernity in a way that is sort of philosophically rigorous and insightful. The problem is that they kind of, in order to come up with solutions, they kind of LARP into science fiction and fantasy. And so you get like the whole neo-pagan perspective where it like Christianity is an impediment upon, or spiritualism generally is an impediment upon what would ordinarily be the vitalism of just the European peoples. But what I think is missing from this perspective is what you were just saying about Christianity terraforming the West, is that they don't understand that peoplehood itself is an organic and transient object that is moved upon by ideological and religious and spiritual forces. And so the race, or the peoples as we know it, cannot really exist independently of a spiritual tradition that guides them. And I think that's what you're kind of getting at here.
Well, it's not merely that, it's also materially as well. I mean, we have to remember the Benedictine order, with nothing but their rule, the lectionary, like, because they often didn't have full Bibles. And the Psalter took Europe from a collapsed state to a highly economically productive area. Like, for example, somebody who came out of this tradition, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. You know, the Clairvaux in his name. It means Clear Valley in French. When he got to the Clear Valley, it wasn't. It was filled. It was like wasteland that had just been provided by the local lord, and they just went and they, through their work, through their diligence, and through their prayer, they cleared it. And at the same time, he produced some of the greatest treasures of Latin literature that exist. And I mean, as much as, of course, the pagans perceive the beautiful and they look at the local Novus Ordo church, and there are many, and I go to the Novus Ordo, right? And they see like ugliness everywhere. They see the morbidly obese man in his 60s who's saying all are welcome. They see like dyed hair LGBT inclusive churches, and they think, well, this is rather cringe. How am I going to find beauty here? And that is a true observation. The church is in a bad place, but we still have the treasure that vivified the very civilization which you love, and also preserved the very texts that you loved as well. Without Alcuin of York, for example, who was a very close advisor of Charlemagne, we would not have the pagan classics, at least the Latin ones, to a large extent. So, like, and a lot of these perceptions as well are going to necessarily be colored by subsequent culture after that. And so what I'm basically saying is, listen, I understand the church is cringe. All are welcome is cringe. Having rainbow banners outside of your church is cringe. But the church, in its writings, which you can seek online, and I know people who live exactly this way as well, personal friends of mine, you can still live a life which is frankly superior to that of Achilles in this tradition. And you can, and I can help you find those works. And I can discuss now where people would want to start if they wanted to start. Or, you know,
No, I mean, I'll set you up for that, right? Because what I found in, you know, this is something that coming through, I always say I'm a new atheist, but I was an atheist before the big, like, Richard Dawkins explosion, like, happened in 2008 or 2009. But one thing as an atheist, like, you read the Bible and you read it, you just kind of like go through the entire book and read all of the text, but don't absorb the spirit. But almost all, in my opinion, in my experience, almost all religious experience comes from hyper focusing on particular elements of the faith, like just going into one book and trying to really understand what spiritual message is being communicated in that moment. And that's to me, that's what oftentimes is missed, is we talk about faith in general, but I don't think faith or religion exists in general. I mean, it does exist in general from God's point of view, but I don't think that faith in general can really exist from a personal point of view. It has to be highly specific and particular.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you should mention for hyper focusing on a single book of scripture, because that's part of what I was going to recommend. And I agree. I mean, there are the people of God. It is not the individual of God. And this is, of course, a flaw in the way, I mean, I was listening to your stream that you did the other day, and you pointed out, you know, whenever you've got pagans that get together, it becomes a longhouse. And I don't think that's any particular flaw in any of the particular pagans. I think that might actually be a result of pagans not knowing proper moral habits as much as the Christians don't. Like there are like part of my job at the moment is working for a network called the Network of Saint. Sorry, my alarms decided to go off. For part of an apostolate called the Network of Saint Nicholas Cavalic, and we work with Muslims who have converted to Catholicism and try to provide them with catechesis and prayer. Now, one of the things that you realize quite quickly is that a lot of the average Muslim is probably more virtuous than the average Catholic, simply because they've come from countries where they have this pre-existing religious tradition which has fragments of the Mosaic covenant in it. Now, the pagans, through no fault of their own, have ended up in a world where we have essentially decided that Moses, that Christ, that St. Paul, that St. Thomas Aquinas don't exist, and we can just do as we please. And unfortunately, first of all, we can't. Like, this isn't a matter of like this. This is what I like about what you really say here a lot. This is indeed a war of belief, but it is not merely the fact, like the submission to a particular ideal, but it is a submission to reality fundamentally. And because the pagans, through no fault of their own, have been distanced from this natural virtue, then it makes sense they're immediately going to be dominated by their passions, particularly towards women, because that is something that is extremely powerful within us. It's like pride, like nobody here can seriously, like, I doubt there is a person here who hasn't suffered from serious sins of lust, because that's just how human beings are often set up. It is a very rare person. Not even like great doctors of the church, like St. Basil the Great, escaped those sorts of sins by his own admission.
I mean, it's also just because like the internet makes it so difficult.
Yeah. I mean, the internet makes it so much worse. But I mean, even in like during what we would call the Dark Ages, I can't remember exactly when this was, but it was before 1066. There were periods where it was hard to find a virgin to marry because people were so drawn into that most easy of vices to fall into that there were negative consequences as a result of that. And it leads to this kind of longhousing, because when you're controlled by that, and moreover when you're controlled by the pride of being with either an attractive woman or some woman of high status, this can lock us into a kind of a slavery and a kind of a cuckoldry. But they don't have the tools to escape that.
Yeah.
No,
I agree. I mean, paganism lives and dies by the passions, but passions, this is something you learn when you get older. You don't trust passions, and you need something that helps you discern a passion that is well ordered from one that's disordered. And that's not something you really understand necessarily as a young man all the time.
I would also add as well, I think this is a serious problem with even our contemporary Catholic communities, because largely because of the death of, I would say that a large part of this is the death of Latin, but also the death of strong instruction. You have a lot of people walking around with very malformed instincts as to what constitutes pursuing the good. And so, like, I wouldn't lay this at the feet of the pagans entirely, and I wouldn't also lay this at the feet of the Protestants, although I would say that there's a certain strand, at least in contemporary Christianity, that tends to really downplay particularly this vice. So I wouldn't lay it entirely at their feet. It's a general problem with our society, and it's something that we need to escape.
So you mentioned Latin. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah. So part of my job is actually I'm a volunteer Latin teacher. So
no way, really?
Yeah.
Actually, how would you recommend? Well, keep on going, but I'll ask you the question afterwards.
Okay, I'll elaborate further. So the thing is that huge amounts of Latin, of not just like beautiful poetry and the thoughts of like various diaries and stuff, but also extremely effective manuals on the scriptures remain untranslated. And like I can honestly say that just for the sake of Cornelius a Lapide's commentaries on the Proverbs and on the Book of Sirach, these are two books on moral wisdom for those who don't know. I'm a richer person, and these aren't translated into English, and so this of course trickles down to the layman. Like I think that there should be, like there was perhaps 100 years ago, a much higher level of people knowing Latin amongst the laity, but this affects the priesthood as well. There was even one person I was told who said that the level of Latin amongst the ecclesiastics at the moment, probably not so much the younger ones, is like extremely poor. And it makes sense because in the 1880s there was a collapse in Latin education, and I've and I mean in my Latin program I've kind of overcome this. Just this isn't something you can buy, unfortunately, fellas. But basically the key to learning Latin is reading a lot. You got to read like huge amounts. So like it's like learning. It's like you become again like a child. Like those who in Britain might remember when they were like 5 or 6 going through guided reading classes where you had these books with different labels indicating their levels of difficulty, and then you progress your way through. Same thing with Latin. I started outside of Lingua Latina Per Si Illustrata, which is a book that a lot of people recommend. Outside of the textbook, I started with the Gospels.
So the Vulgate version of the Gospels.
Yes.
Go ahead. But what was the other book what's the English translation of that first book you mentioned?
So, La Lingua Latina Per Si Illustrata is a book that is intended to infer Latin through itself. The literal translation is the Latin language illustrated through itself. So, I might have it in my bookshelf in arm's reach. Yes, there we go. So, you have these passages, and they give pictures and stuff like this. And the idea is that you read these chapters perhaps half a dozen times, and then you sort of come to an apprehension of what's going on, and then you move on to the next chapter and rinse and repeat. And this will give you enough of a foundation if you're willing to sit with a dictionary and with maybe a Douay Rheims Bible to go through the Gospels and through the epistles. Maybe start with the epistles of John if you want something easy. But it really does come down to a lot of reading. I didn't expect to talk a lot about Latin. I actually had it in my mind to keep that thing to a minimum.
it has. I mean, this is something that I don't want to derail your thing, but I mean, the importance of having sort of a language that's apart from the language of the marketplace and the language of modernity is something that I think is a critical step. And I have never studied Latin myself, and I've constantly thought that maybe this is a step that will be necessary to create sort of a language of spirituality and poetry that's apart from what the ordinary people speak, and that provides sort of a layer of, there's something that people talk a lot about in the Dissident Right. So this in particular, Kryptos, who's seems to be thinking very much along the same lines you are, although I think much more from a Protestant perspective. And he talks about how Christians need to strive to be, at least in part, illegible to the modern world. And this could be a beginning of that, as I see it.
I think it's even more than that. I'm speaking specifically about Lapidae here. He goes through the whole of Proverbs, and he ends up producing 900 pages of commentary on this small book. This book has like 10,500 words in Latin or something like that, right? And it's like his writing is so beautiful, quite frankly. He takes each of the proverbs and he breaks down what they mean, but he also provides huge collections of stories from classical antiquity. He talks about the various lives of the saints. I mean, he does this in the Gospels. Actually, you can find English translations of his commentaries on the Gospels, but unfortunately, the Anglican that translated them in the 19th century decided to occasionally omit the fun parts, the actually interesting parts that like really draw the soul in. And he goes on, like he'll take a reading on, say, the proper working of, properly working, and he will provide examples of like, well, here is how, if you just work your bum off repeatedly for like 72 hours a week or like 100 hours a week, this isn't going to work. Or how prayer feeds our work. He says, this is where I got my example of the Benedictines from, who terraformed Europe. He says, with their breviaries, the Benedictines were able to become inordinately richer than the writers and the knights that were around them. And it was through prayer. It wasn't through the operation of their hands. It was through a life that is fundamentally contemplative, which they were able to attain this. That there wasn't frantic action, and I understand why people are frightened of action. Like I agree. I think to sit and stew neurotically in in your ideology, that can't happen. But the contemplative life ultimately draws out what is best in mankind and informs the action when we do it. So they must be placed first. But like you get these beautiful things that you wouldn't find in English. Like you can I heard one of the people on your stream the other day talk about reading the Aeneid. Like you can read the Aeneid in English, that's fine, you'll get the information, but I don't imagine it's possible, given how English works, to quite replicate how it was written.
Yeah.
I say this having never read it in English or in Latin.
Well, I mean, the book that I kind of go back to that's similar is Dante's Divine Comedy, which I never read it in Italian, but I was part of a group that read portions of it in Italian, and it did really enhance the experience to see how it linguistically flowed. That being said, we had to kind of, for the mainstay of the reading, just revert back to the translation for most of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an important thing, but I think getting people to a point where we can go, where we can because I can give you guys a starting point if you want, because you don't have to go and learn Latin if you don't want to. I think in a superior culture we would, but really, I think that there's a real quite a serious problem, as I mentioned at the beginning, with people being depressed and aimless and not being focused enough. And I can provide, I can provide something very quick that people can do. Like it would only take them perhaps 45 minutes a day to do this, and this is going to hopefully, perhaps in 6 months, completely change the tone of the movement. In 6 months, if people did this.
Oh, you mean to the subject of personal development?
Yes, you'd have people, I think, ending up a lot less hurt by what they see. Like they'd still we still know that there's a problem with drag queen story time, and that's always going to be a problem, right? But you're going to be less drawn in by it. Like you can acknowledge the problem, and because you're less drawn into it, it becomes much easier to think about possible solutions to the problem and to get it in perspective, because these are horrible things. And indeed, as a father myself, I'm not so worried about my son, but I think that if I ever have daughters, I'm going to be I'm not going to get much sleep over this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, I only have a son as well, and it's hard to think about. It's hard to think about like the path that this is what a lot of parents are saying. When our parents assumed that the path we would take would be more or less following them, which just didn't turn out to be true. We had to find our own way, and a lot of people got lost along the way. And I want to give my son more than that. I want to give him a path to follow as a young man that will put him in some kind of community that has his best interests at heart, to complement what you're saying.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I sort of zoned out because I just checked over the chat. Yeah, so sorry, could you repeat that?
People are saying I'm trying to distract you. All I'm doing is kind of giving examples from my own life to complement what you're saying. But I was saying, in our generation, our parents assumed that we just follow the same path that they did, that the countries that we lived in just had our best interests at heart, and the mainstream path was the way to go. But that turned out not to be the case. We had to find our own way, and I'm looking for some similar path of development, in particular for young men, that will allow them to develop themselves, but also be part of a community, build into a community that has their best interest at heart.
And I mean, I can provide that. And I think the clue to the solution to this is one of the solutions, probably one of the most important ones, is going to be the proper practice of mental prayer. So this, for those who don't know, is where, like you mentioned earlier on about focusing in on one book of the scriptures and really drilling into it. You take some book of the scriptures, say the New Testament. There are 3 books that I think would be particularly helpful for this community. The first one being Story of a Soul by Saint Therese of Lisieux. The second one being Humility of Heart by Father Mary I think his name's Father Cajetan Mary de Bergamo. But if you type Humility of Heart, you'll find that. And the third one would be Preparation for Death by Saint Alphonsus Liguori. What you do is you take one of these books. Hopefully you've given it a read through beforehand to get the gist of the book. Like, you don't have to, you can just sprint through it. You get the gist of the book, you understand what he's getting at. And what you do is you take a small portion of that. In the scriptures, you could open up the Gospel of Mark and read out the first few verses even. Ideally, this would be focused on some particular problem that you have, and a book like Humility of Heart is going to be targeted at a proper recognition of man's place in relation to God. Preparation for Death will focus in on recognizing, we are only here for some time, and provide, information on proper approach to that. And St. Teresa of Lisieux, St. Teresa of Lisieux is a doctor of the church, so is Alphonsus as well. But she kind of captures the mind in a way that I don't think it's like she's like the anti-BAP. She's like the polar opposite of BAP.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, she's like the polar opposite of BAP.
I'm gonna remember. I'm gonna steal that one, man. I'm gonna steal that one.
But like, whereas BAP will come out with bravado, and whereas we see in our movement from other people talking in very Machiavellian, or at least the dissident rights movement, like talking in very Machiavellian terms, nonsense, 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 therefore we rule. She is a very sincere and very wise person, and a very tough one as well. Like, I can't imagine sitting Bronze Age pervert down to have his clothes measured out, shoving the clothespin into his shoulder and him not screaming. But that's what Teresa of Lisieux was. And she was a young woman. She didn't live past 24. But to get back to
she died very young, not just like I thought it was like, I thought she died when she was 30. She died when she was in her early 20s.
She was younger than me. Yeah. Right, wow. I'm barely out of the womb, right, and she died before me. So like, what you do is you just take a passage from this. It can be anything. You read it out, and you consider it in the context of your own life, and in the context of what's going on, and then you talk to God about it, and through that conversation with God, and the response often comes through the disposition and how you change, and how you sort of realize things in that state, because you find that you sort of just click things, and like, by that process you sort of build up on top of that. I'd just like to quickly actually I'll talk to him later. I'm seeing Saeed Hassan Ahmed in the comments. Don't worry, I know what I'm doing. So through this process and through practicing this, we're going to be able to perceive, not only be happier, but also perceive reality in proportion. And that sort of leads into another point. And this is really the sort of the brass tacks kind of intellectual problem with the dissident right, which is that nobody is concluding like there's no systematic approach to what we're doing. Like, you have these disparate elements which have come forth from different strains of thought. You have people who've listened to Evola, you have people who read Burnham, you have Carlyle, you have all of this sort of perhaps half a dozen, maybe a dozen authors that sort of influence people, but none of these people have an actually systematic view, as far as I'm aware. Burnham I haven't heard of. I know Carlyle is a novelist. I've read Evola, and Evola, I'd probably heat my house with Robinson on World, to be quite honest with you. I thought it was.
I mean, you're right. I think that Carlyle was very much trying to piggyback off an existing Western civilization. I think he had a coherent vision, but I don't think it makes sense now, because these sort of concepts of peoplehood and nation that were very much on Carlyle's mind no longer exist, and his religiosity was vague and deistic, and so I think you're correct in that there's no systematic point of view. I think the idea that the dissident right had was, well, we all recognize a common set of problems. So let's start organizing and meeting in real life and creating conferences and discussion spaces around those kind of perceptions of the problem, and then work out the details of the systematic dimension of spirituality later. And that's I think that was the idea, right?
I completely see, like of course meeting up in real life is extremely important because these internet relationships are just not as strong as the ones in real life. But one critique I have, and this is actually, I mean, besides the spiritual problem, like one of the reasons why, as much as I'm talking about I don't consider myself a part of the dissident right, is because even if you bring all of these people together, if they're improperly formed in their principles, which they are, a lot of them, and I don't mean their moral principles, I mean their intellectual principles, then it's going to be, like, to be quite frank, it's going to be garbage in and garbage out. If you've got people who are operating as if Julius Evola is the pinnacle of spirituality, which, I mean, like, there were moments I was reading through Revolt Against the Modern World and I was laughing at him. Like, he doesn't,
there's
like, his
perspectives
sure. His perspectives on Christianity, it's like he just took like 1880s like form criticism, just copied and pasted it, and then he's like quoting Jerome, and it's like, well, this is how Mary is like a pagan goddess. Ooh, I mean, this guy grew up in the bloody the 1900s in Italy, and this guy is coming out with like nonsense. And like, you could just, instead of like meeting together and discussing on this, wouldn't it be better to read from what God has given us and what time has proven? For those who don't have faith in the magisterium of the church or in the scriptures, you cannot deny we have created the strongest and greatest civilization in human history, and the Catholic Church is the most stable institution, likewise, in human history. So rather than going through Burnham or Carlyle, and indeed they have their insights, rather than just doing this, why not look at the principles that built such a great institution, learn those, and then apply them to the modern problems?
Yeah, I think you're correct. I mean, ultimately, the church fathers and the scripture are going to be what's going to matter most going forward. I think that this, the fascination with Burnham and Evola and Carlyle, and I will defend Carlyle as being a great author, but I think that these people are trying to. A lot of people can't see the necessary element of religion and classical faith because they're stuck on this concept, like these sort of false idols of modernity. And those authors that we both mentioned, I mean, they're really kind of dispelling this. They're kind of breaking the spell of this modern myth that's in front of them.
Right, but they're ultimately just picking up pieces from what the church has given us. Like, for example, right, I think, like, there are people in the comment section going on about like Pope Francis being silly and stuff, but really, like, what would make Francis make a lot more sense is if you guys actually knew the Catholic faith. Because, like, for example, right, something that might strike people as a bit weird. Why, there are detailed reasons as to why sins of lust are not as bad as, even though they're both mortal sins, are not as bad as sins of pride. Like, even in a practical sense, it's a lot easier to repent of engaging in the sexual act outside of marriage than it is to repent of an act of pride. And like, not like the problem is that there's no established means of formation. And when we could be doing things like getting to a point where we can understand standard authors like St. Thomas or the scriptures, instead you're focusing on Burnham. Like, sure, Burnham, fine, yeah. Evola, fine. Carlyle, fine. They have their strengths. But we have limited time on this planet. Why don't we focus on the more distilled authors who offer something that is more battle-tested? And well, not only that, it's more true, quite frankly.
Oh, it's certainly more eternal. Yeah. I mean, I think I accept the critique. I mean, how would you, for instance, if I just hand somebody who's struggling with modern problems, the issue, though, I think, Renaissance man, and I think you're right in the abstract. The issue is that people are struggling with certain crises right now. And the challenge is to translate the ancient wisdom into a way that makes that feels directly that feels as if it's directly addressing their problem. And this is something that, I think the reason why there was this explosion in unbelief in new atheism, like the fedora phenomenon of the early 2000s or late 2000s, was that a lot of the religious wisdom was not properly translated into a way that made sense to modern people. And I think that is sort of like the struggle, is that it is very hard to take the wisdom literature that you're talking about and translating that into a way where people can see how it's building towards something. I agree with you in the abstract. I just think that this task is not been completed yet, or we haven't even scratched the surface of it.
Well, I mean, I can give you, a specific place to start for everyone here would be to follow, I think, besides the mental prayer, which I've discussed here, which I think is important for giving people the right like approach to the world, is to start with, I think sacred scripture is a good place to start. St. Jerome provides a list in a document called Spiritus Paracletus. I'll just recite it here because it's easier, of where you start. And so what you do is you would start with the book of Proverbs and read that with a commentary. And there's a commentary I've heard recommended very strongly from, indeed, Syed Hassan Ahmed. He's a personal friend of mine, which is the Ancient Christian Writers Collection, commentary on that. That tends to expound out more abstract meanings on it. But having this book down and having it, really, really down pat is the key to having a proper moral life, which then leads to proper political action. And not only that, a proper consideration of how the state should even look, because ultimately politics feeds off of moral theology. So
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and likewise, you read the Psalms at the same time and you pray those, and then you move on to Ecclesiastes, Job, and to the Gospels after that, I believe. So like this is the first thing. The second thing, if you want other practical things to do with like actual philosophy, then I would recommend there's a channel called Scholastic Answers on YouTube, and the guy who runs it, Christian Wagner, has all kinds of different streams on different theological topics and different moral topics occasionally. And he's produced on another channel called Distinguo. I'll ask like Hassan if you could type that into the chat, because that's a Latin word. He provides like concrete advice on certain things and also talks about certain moral issues. So I think this is a good practical place to start. There are other people as well that you could watch as well. Like I got my start watching the videos on vices and virtues by Father Chad Ripperger. And that ended up completely changing my life for the better.
Yeah, he's good.
Yeah, watching those videos, particularly internalizing what the daughters of the different vices are, which are basically the consequences that you get for falling into certain sins. So, for example, falling into sins of lust is going to make you less able to actually do anything. It cripples you.
Yeah,
he will articulate that.
No, I mean, falling into sin of lust, certainly. I've highlighted the YouTube channel that you just described. So that's that. I think people can see that right now. What do you say? I mean, I think I like this idea, but what I think probably this project would be best pursued with groups of people. That's what seems to me would be most interesting or most effective way to pursue this project.
I agree. I think that if you had somebody who already knew their stuff in this respect, because I think that if you just had a bunch of people who are completely unformed just go at this, you could end up with some mistakes. I think that's a very good place to start. I think I'd also like, if there's anybody here who knows Latin, they're going to have access to much superior commentaries, at least as far as I'm aware, and they're free. So I mean, I haven't got experience with this Christian Writers Collection one. I've only had it recommended to me by other people. But I know for a fact that Lapiday's commentaries on Sirach and on Proverbs are wonderful.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I actually don't know those ones, but I mean, I can say that's a good place to start.
Cornelius Alapide is the full name, by the way. Hazan, if you could type that in the chat.
I think I'm going to need to ask you for. I put a few of your links in the description, but I'm going to need to ask perhaps for more links so that people can go find all of these things after the stream.
I didn't want to bombard you with links. My wife was
no.
recommending you send more, but I was like, I don't want to push my luck.
No, I'll do it. I mean, like, this is. I'll say this to sort of like merge our projects a little bit. I mean, we've been focusing a lot on meetups and community building, or at least I have. And one of the problems here is that a lot of these communities don't have a proper understanding of mission and aspiration. Because the thing with the meetups is like, you go to meetup, you meet a bunch of people and get drinks or whatever. But then it's like, okay, what do we do now? Just like constantly have these meetups and complain about the world? Like, that's not the point. The point should be development, further development of community and spirituality and scholarly spiritualities. I mean, this might be, I'm wondering, would you recommend that we pursue this in groups and kind of make it the group kind of be more open to different, both, we're always talking about this from more of a Catholic perspective, but a lot of people will be Protestant or lapsed or atheists, or maybe even they're attracted to paganism. Do you think that this project would be good to pursue? Just, okay, you're here to learn about this spiritual tradition, and we're not going to assume any spiritual background right up front, but we're going to be learning about this as a part of what could be anyone's tradition, and then the door is open if you want to take the step into Christianity or Catholicism specifically.
I think that's a good start. I think that I qualify it though, because like I said, there needs to be a source of people who are already formed, and so like for the benefit of the people here who aren't aware, my group, because we were originally part of ClearTrads. ClearTrads got shut down.
I remember that.
Split off
multiple times. I got banned at least 3 times by Discord in 2020.
Yeah. So we ended up forming our own group, and this is how we came to these conclusions. Because before we were very much in the 2018 I'm very edgy mindset. So this is how we ended up coming to these conclusions. So I think that it would be worth reaching out to perhaps, I mean, at least just to get a point of contact through Riverrun or somebody like that, or Mathoma.
Great guy.
Mathoma is very active with Network of St. Nicholas Tablage, but this is unrelated. But like getting into contact with the people who are properly formed first before launching in on this project. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think that having like atheists and pagans, and I mean, I think Protestants and Orthodox, I mean, I think they can gain things from this. But my experience as a former atheist and as a pagan, I think that they need to actually know what Christianity is first, because they don't know. I mean, like I've seen online like all this talk about different things. Like I'm just going to quote people who just quote Bible quotes and then just put their own spin on it and decide that for some reason Friedrich Nietzsche is their Bible commentator, right? Like we need to, like you guys need to utterly crush this tendency, because otherwise you're just going to have, well, first of all, disordered people running around causing, because I mean, I this is something that I don't quite understand as an outsider. Like I see people who are quite prominent in this movement, and I'm not talking about BAP here, who just have like they really obviously don't seem to be acting in good faith, or they're crazy. Like these people need to like you said on the last stream, you need to tap them on the shoulder and like tell them you're nuts. They need to come down to earth, some of them, and some of them I just don't think should be trusted. So those people should just be ignored. But the people who are genuinely interested, they should be given a foundation in what Christianity actually is. And I think, I mean, I don't know if Christian Wagner's a good start. I don't think he necessarily is, but perhaps looking at there's another channel called Thomistic Institute. That might be a good start.
Oh yeah, I'm subscribed to them, I believe.
Yeah, like that might be a good start. Like it's all well and good me talking about these spiritual practices at the beginning is because I recognize that there's a lot of spiritual issues in the community first, and I think that before we get into heady intellectual stuff, you need to sit down and meditate and work certain things out before you're even in a position to sort of grasp onto those things.
Yeah.
So, whereas these guys, first of all, they think they know and they don't. and like I mean they need to be made aware of that, and I think that maybe the Thomistic Institute would be a good start. I mean, Hassan, feel free to correct me. I mean, Hassan is somebody who is stronger in this kind of academic theological knowledge, and so you should take his word over mine. But that's just my instinct sitting here right now.
Yes, I mean, we're describing sort of a necessary step, and the question is just how to get people to get over the bridge, and that initial step is just really, really hard. I mean, I think coming into contact with people who are more formed, as you put it, is definitely how I would recommend it. The question is, in my experience, it always makes a big difference if you can meet with them face to face or in an actual physical environment. That's not always possible, I found.
Yeah, I agree, but I think the first thing that needs to happen is that like you guys, like I mean, there's no reason why any good political project would need them to succeed. That's the first thing that needs to be made clear, because like the pagans can say, oh, they need us, we need you, or like you need us. We don't. First of all, that needs to be made clear. And I say this because I mean, like you say, first of all, they don't show up. Second of all, like there's a lot of stuff which just like kind of seems a bit like underpowered. I mean, actually, I won't be cruel. I'll keep my mouth shut on that one. But basically, like what needs to happen is there needs to be the necessary humility on the part of the secular and atheist members of the dissident right. If it can even, if this even succeeds, it's probably going to evolve into something else, like you said the other day. I think it will. There needs to be recognition that, frankly, the boomers at church aren't a good representation of this tradition and never were. And they need to actually investigate it if they're going to understand people who they at least claim on the face of it to be their allies.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there definitely is sort of a conversation that needs to happen upon these things, because I'm really tired of reading the same recycled fedora version of Nietzsche posted on Substack every other week.
I mean,
it's so repetitive.
I mean, I don't know what they're seeking to achieve. I mean, from the outside, the way that they're coming across to me, it's like they're not taking it seriously, as if it's not their kids that couldn't get truths, right? Like, let's be honest here. Like we can play around and like have funny art projects and stuff, but at the end of the day, if we don't do something and we don't reclaim our civilization, then our children are going to be the worst.
And that's the thing about children too, is they need to see you participating in religious practice. That's the most important thing for them to see. And I don't want to call myself devout, but devout religious practice. They want to see that you actually believe it.
Yeah, that's an important step. But I also think that as well, having the spiritual wherewithal, avoiding near occasions of sin, because a lot of people don't convert. I imagine in these circles it might be different, but a lot of people don't deconvert for intellectual reasons. They deconvert because they had a mistake and slept with their boyfriend or something like that. Yeah. Right. So just having that basic moral education there is just as important as practicing. I mean, practicing in front of them. I mean, that's a bloody given. I mean, like what business have you got calling yourself Catholic if you don't believe it? Right. Yeah. That's the first thing. I mean, like as an ethnic identifier. I mean, what ethnicity, bro? First of all. Second of all, having this moral formation and having the spiritual formation, and thirdly, having at least, I'd say having like an actual intellectual apprehension of what's going on as well. Like these things are always these things are always there, and that I think those three things are things that you need.
No, 100%. I mean, these are all things. So, I know you've been describing your project all along, but maybe in the last 5 minutes, you can kind of talk about what your plans are for expansion and how people might be able to help out. I know I have a PayPal link in the description that you forwarded me.
Thank you. Yeah,
no, it's no problem. But I mean, you guys can check it out there, along with the YouTube channel that we're kind of putting in the description. But in the last 5 minutes, I kind of want to give you a runway to kind of reiterate the call to action for your average viewer who watches my channel, and I assume that's who we're broadcasting to, unless there's a new audience here today. And then, you know, is interested in right-wing politics and maybe has gone to some in real life organizing, but may have kind of more vague understanding of spirituality and the necessity of that.
So I mean, but the project that I was going to talk about isn't so much about, you know, people here. I mean, I've given, I think, some starting points for people if they want to just get started. But shall I just talk about the network of St. Nicholas Tablet for a moment?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so in the last, like, so at the beginning of August, myself and a number of other people from the UK met up with an Argentine priest called Father Federico Huyton. Now, Father Federico Huyton is a founding member of the Order of Saint Elijah, and he's established a subordinate project to that called the Omnes Gentes Project. Unfortunately, their website is currently in Spanish. Now, as a subordinate, we have a subsection of this called the Network of Saint Nicholas Tavelich. St. Nicholas Tavelich was a Franciscan who lived in Jerusalem when it was controlled by the Muslims. This was just after the conquest. I think this was 200 years after the conquest of Jerusalem by the Muslims again. And he recognized that people were not being brought to Christianity as strongly by their taking care of the holy sites. And so they decided to preach the gospel at the Mosque of Umair in Jerusalem and end up being martyred for it. Now that comes into our mission. Our mission is to provide for Muslim converts to Roman Catholicism the catechesis and special liturgical needs that they have in their own countries. Now, all of us, aside from Father Federico, who, you know, great guy, wonderful guy. You can read about him on the Catholic News Agency if you want. We have just begun. We're a bunch of guys who have been brought together to establish this network, and we need financial support so that we can go ahead with this. But besides that, there's also some meetups coming that I think people will be interested in. There are going to be meetups in Charlotte, in North Carolina, and there's going to be meetups in Orlando as well, in Florida. Now, I don't have the information on the ones in Florida, but I do have the information. I have information on some from Charlotte. So he's going to be doing talks on missions ad gentes, which is to the nations, because part of his work is evangelizing in Malawi, in various other places around the world. And so if you want to hear his talks, he's going to be giving them at 7 p.m. on September the 14th and on the 15th at 8 and 10:30 p.m. at the sacred. Actually, I think these are the masses he's doing. Oh, never mind. These are the masses. The talk, the masses are going to be that he's offering are going to be on September the 14th and the 15th at Sacred Heart Church in Brevard in North Carolina. The talk, which is going to be at St. Thomas Aquinas Catholic Church in North Carolina on September the 18th at 6:30. And he's probably going to mention the order, but the focus is going to be on the broader mission of the Omnes Gentes project, of which we're subordinate.
Excellent. And unfortunately, I am at time, but Renaissance Man, I'm really glad to talk to you again after so many years and after there have been so many changes in our
I'm told. Sorry, I'm told. Sorry, Hassan has told me I've gotten it wrong. I mean, I've just got can you? Yeah, because
make the correction.
Yeah, I'll make the correction now while we're on here. Can you please send it to me? Because I'm sorry. I'm just reading what I had in the DMs here.
Oh, no problem.
I received them from someone else. I'll be quick.
What the thing is here is that actually, you should send me the links, and I'll put a blurb of them in the description. I have 3 links right now, but I think that this live stream really we need to have like a very good index, because people are going to hear what you're saying. They're going to agree, but they're going to want to follow up. So, yeah, I have to go in like a minute, but
I'll write that out. I'll like Hassan, if you send me the information in DMs, I'll just relay it to Dave, and then when you find a convenient moment, if you could stick it in the
I certainly will.
Fantastic.
But Renaissance Man, thank you so much for appearing, and thank you so much for the information on this new project. I really hope people check it out, and I hope that we can merge our organizing efforts with this direction to give people actual resources, not just talk about spirituality, but actually pursue it. So
Well,
again, yeah, go ahead.
crack on, like, guys, you need to crack on, you need to put in the work, and we can make our societies better, but we have to deal with these problems now, because if we don't, we're the only people who are, well, you're part of like a very small minority who are actually aware of this. It all rides on God and our response to him. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks so much. I'll talk to you later, and have a blessed rest of your weekend, and a happy Labor Day if you're in America.
All right. Thank you very much for having me on.
Bye.